This video supported in part by...
Playing VR, I tend to sweat. It gives me an edge. So King of Nerds happens to give me an edge too. Let King of Nerds give you the edge. Bye, King of Nerds.
I spend a lot of time here on GenXGrownUp reviewing tabletop arcade toys. These are little collectible machines in the shape of classic arcade cabinets that have arcade games or some version of the arcade game in them. And because I review so many of them, I often have people asking me, "Hey John, just real quick, tell me, what are the best ones? What are the best ones you have seen?" Well, I'm finally going to cover that for you here right now. Hey there, welcome back to GenXGrownUp. I am John and I am a GenXGrownUp. Thank you so much for the click. In order to qualify for this top 10 list, a product must only meet 3 criteria. First, it has to be one that I have seen and reviewed. I've seen a lot of them. Admittedly, not every single one, so this list is based on my 5 years of experience playing with, collecting, and reviewing these toys. The second criteria is it must be an arcade cabinet toy. So that means pocket players, handheld things, tiny micro arcades from Super Impulse, those sorts of things don't qualify. It must be at least in the shape of an arcade cabinet because honestly, that's what got me interested in collecting these in the first place. And finally, they must all be $50 or less. Now, I'm not talking about what it would cost to go and get it now, what the markup is on eBay. I can't control that. I'm talking about the original manufacturer suggested retail price, that MSRP of $50 or less. So that's it. If you're an arcade toy, I've seen you and you're under 50 bucks, you were eligible to make this list. Okay, why don't we get started right away with the number 10 pick. This is an arcade game that actually was never an arcade game, but it is in my heart. I'm talking about the Basic Fun Arcade Classics release of Fix-It Felix Jr. Now you probably already know that Fix-It Felix Jr. was only an arcade game inside of Wreck-It Ralph, the Disney animated film. But Disney fleshed out a whole plausible arcade game. They even shipped arcade cabinets around the country to promote Wreck-It Ralph. And while you could download a mobile game or play a flash game of Fix-It Felix, none of those were really good representations of what we saw in the film. But Basic Fun got the license from Disney to do an arcade classics version of Fix-It Felix Jr. And while it is not a real arcade game, it is definitely a real arcade game. It has the same spirit, the same tone, and having it available as an arcade toy makes it feel even realer to me as a genuine arcade game, and it was a really good version of the game. All right, you ready? Let's move along to number 9. You likely know I'm not a huge fan of shoving NES ROMs into these cabinets and calling it a day, but in some cases that was enough, and it's true of our number 9, and that's the My Arcade Microplayer Rolling Thunder. Rolling Thunder is an amazing arcade game, and it's one that I would go back to time and time again. And luckily, while not perfectly accurate as you might expect from the NES, this Rolling Thunder was a very good version, and it represented the adventure of play. You have upgradable weapons and pickups, you have all the variety of different enemies, and you have an adventure you can play through. It's not like your early arcade games. There is a beginning, middle, and end so you can save the girl. Now, of course, that loops around, but all of that is represented here in the arcade game, and that makes Rolling Thunder my number 9 pick. All right, moving along then to number 8. The classics are the classics, and when Basic Fun got in their groove of putting out the arcade classics, they started doing a really good job. They skipped over the NES stuff and wrote some of their own versions. And Dig Dug was a prime example of a great rewritten version of an arcade classic put into one of these little tiny toys. Now, of course, the gameplay is not 100% arcade accurate, but it is very playable and it's very representative of the original Dig Dug game. They did a great job of rewriting the game so that it represents and invokes the feeling of Dig Dug. If you're not gonna do the actual arcade ROM, this, I would say, is the next best thing. Don't give me whatever port we had on the NES. Instead, write something that invokes the spirit of the game you're trying to do, and they did that very well with Dig Dug. All right, let's move along then to number 7. If you're a longtime viewer of GenXGrownUp, as we move along this list, it's going to become less and less surprising. But arcade ROMs, while not the linchpin, it is one of the key factors I was looking for in these tabletop arcade toys. And that's exactly what I got in this premium edition Contra from My Arcade. This is the arcade ROM of Contra. This is exactly the experience that we had on screen when playing Contra. Now, even though it's an arcade ROM, it didn't rate any higher on my list because my arcade kind of under-delivered on the hardware here. It's kind of the exact same hardware we saw for the standard micro players, and the screen was nothing to write home about. But you had that original arcade ROM, and that's what we got with this unit. It is the original arcade ROM, therefore you got the original arcade experience, and that puts it this high on my list because it earns it. Yeah? All right, let's move along then to number 6. And this one might come as a bit of a surprise, especially coming on the heels of a cabinet that had the original arcade ROM in it. But my number 6 spot absolutely goes to Super Impulse's tiny arcade version of Pole Position. This was a very playable version of Pole Position. No, it's not the original ROM. Yes, it's rewritten to work on this tiny hardware, on this tiny screen, with a tiny steering wheel shaped controller. Racing games in general are hugely underrepresented across the entire line of collectible arcade toys, so Pole Position was a welcome diversion from all the little single-screen arcade games, and plus, even though it's not the arcade ROM, even though it's not going to invoke the absolute feeling you had in the arcade, it is a really fun and playable version of this game, and fun is the important part there. Worthy entry at number 6. Before we move on, very quickly I want to remind you that if you enjoy the stuff you watch on GenXGrownUp, would you please consider supporting us? That could be as simple as a like or a subscribe, or consider supporting us over on Patreon financially. I'm currently trying to make GenXGrownUp my full-time, all-the-time gig, and to do that, I'm going to need your help. So think about it, see what you can do. I really appreciate your consideration. Okay, let's move on into the top 5 with number 5. There's a bit of a division about this one in the collecting community over whether or not this is a good release or a bad release, but I really enjoyed it. And squeaking in just under the $50 limit at $49.99 was this premium edition My Arcade Micro Player of Street Fighter II. This was a custom-built piece of hardware designed to release Street Fighter II, Champion Edition in this case, by the way. It has all 6 buttons, it has a nice tall bat-top joystick, the layout, design, the artwork, the bezel, everything about this was perfect for Street Fighter. But there were a lot of little details that made this slip lower to number 5 on my list. The buttons were out of order in color, no big deal, we fixed that, that's not really a ding, but the joystick often feels a little floppy, as many people have said. The frame rate on the screen is not quite what it could be, especially for a fighting game where you're sometimes counting frames if you play like that. And there was a control logic where you could not perform some moves. That's the big deal. There was a limitation in the hardware and the logic on the board that meant you couldn't do every move you wanted. Now, for many people it didn't matter and it didn't impact their enjoyment of the game, but depending on how big a fan you are of Street Fighter and how well you know it, that might have been a problem for you. I understand that in any more recent release where the buttons are red, white, and blue already, they fixed that logic. I haven't tested it for myself, but I've heard it anecdotally, so if you've been holding out and that was your problem, maybe check back into this one, but it's still a worthy entry, even as it stands at number 5. All right, moving on then, number 4. This is the second and last title on my list that has an NES ROM in it. Not many of them made my list because not many of them impressed me, but this My Arcade Micro Player release of Bubble Bobble, I wholly enjoyed. Admittedly, I was not a big Bubble Bobble fan before getting this micro player, but in reviewing it, I discovered what I'd been missing all this time. Bubble Bobble is a platform puzzle game, and the NES version of it did such a good job of translating what was in the arcade to this little toy, then I really had no complaints. Now, honestly, the fact that I wasn't closely attached to the original arcade version could very well be coloring my perception of this Bubble Bobble. And very much like the Pole Position before it, this toy is just fun. And in many cases, that trumps other criteria. I could be upset about an NES ROM, but what, cutting off my nose to spite my own face? If it's fun, it's fun. And I'm gonna call exactly what it is. This was a really good release and a solid one for number 4. Okay, moving on to number 3. It would be a shame to have a top 10 list of tabletop arcade machine toys and not have Pac-Man represented. Luckily, he is. And you've got to be very careful. This is the number 14 Pac-Man release from Basic Fun's Arcade Classics line. They put out about 4 or 5 different Pac-Man. They had, I don't know, they had the black and white one, they had the color LCD one, they had this one, they had another one like this, they had the 40th anniversary version, all these different ones. But this is the one that I really most enjoyed. Just like the Arcade Classics Dig Dug before it, this was a custom rewritten version of Pac-Man that sounded right, felt right, played right. Now, if you're a Pac-Man stickler, this is not absolutely exactly Pac-Man because the ghosts don't follow the proper logic. It doesn't do everything you would expect to do. You can't use your patterns. But if you're looking for a fun and representative way to play and relive the king of arcade games, this number 14 Pac-Man is a great way to relive the fun you had playing Pac-Man for about 20 bucks, you know? All right, number 2 is next. And this one even surprised me when I put all the ones I had on a list and started stacking them. This is above this, no, that's worse than this, that kind of thing. I cannot believe where Tetris, the arcade classic release from Basic Fun, landed at number 2. Again, it comes down to what they delivered and how much fun it is. I admitted in my review, I am not a super fan or regular player of Tetris. I played it casually, I was not a devotee of the arcade game, so Tetris to me is rewritten so many times that it doesn't have to be the original arcade game to be a good or fun version of Tetris. And Basic Fun packed so much value add into this Tetris that they didn't have to. There's a menu full of settings, there's audio settings, there's high score preservation, there's so much in this delivery. The presentation of the package was just was one of the best I've seen from Basic Fun. If they did more games like this, they would sell more games, absolutely. So even though I'm not a huge Tetris fan, man, I tip my cap to this Tetris release from Basic Fun as our number 2. All right, you're probably not gonna be surprised as we move right into our number 1. It is and has been since it was released the gold standard for a sub $50 arcade cabinet toy, and that is this premium edition Space Invaders from My Arcade. Wow, I could not believe what they delivered here. Not only is it some sort of original Space Invaders arcade ROM, but they have a steel shaft ball top joystick, the beautiful original artwork on the side, but most importantly, the depth that lets you have that reflected moonscape where your playfield is kind of a parallax behind you. It not only gives you the game that you played in the arcade digitally, but it recreates the perception you have as you look into the machine. This was just a masterstroke for My Arcade, and still I can't believe it was only $40. This is by far still my favorite arcade toy. I think I have 2 more in a box still because I just don't want to be without. This was a fantastic release, and if you don't have this one, if you're looking for one to get to represent kind of what is the best in class of these kind of collectibles, Space Invaders, this one is it. Down in the description of this video, I will put links to all the videos where I originally reviewed these units that we talked about if you want to dig in a little deeper. I also will put links to Amazon where you can go and shop for these items if you want them in your collection but don't yet have them. I'll put links to a couple of the ones we talked about here over my shoulder if you'd like to dive in. I certainly hope you found something to enjoy in this video though, and I will talk to you next time. Bye-bye.